Thanks for joining us, everybody. I'm glad you could be here. I am Julie Brown. I'm the Raptor Migration and Programs Director at HMANA. We are really excited to be welcoming Elly Knight today, who's going to be talking about Common Nighthawk research. And this is not a raptor, but I know a lot of us hawk watchers are familiar with seeing these graceful flyers at our hawk watches each spring or fall. And some of us I know are conducting migration counts on this species. It's a species I am definitely excited to learn more about. I am going to be facilitating things today along with Kat Lauer, who's over in Vermont, and she is our administrative assistant at HMANA. And just a few things before we get started. As usual, we are recording today's event. We're also live streaming on our Facebook page. And you can view any of our Lunch and Learn programs on our Facebook page anytime or on our website. You scroll down to our What's New section on our homepage. And I think we are up to date at this point with all our past Lunch and Learns. They should all be up there. Adjusting your display if you need to can be done on your screen by clicking on those three dots in the upper top right corner of your screen. And we are now disabling all the audio and video just so that we found it's the best way to reduce distractions during our talks. And even though you're muted, we really want to continue engaging with you and connecting with you. So we encourage you to use the chat to ask questions or make comments. Kat is going to be reading your questions, keeping track of them as they come in for Elly, and she'll read them to her at the end of the program. And we love hearing where you're tuning in from, so you can use the chat to type in where you're from or where you're joining from, what hawk watch you represent, maybe an exciting spring migrant you've seen recently. Mine was a parula this morning while walking the dog that took my breath away. And if you don't already get HMANA's e-newsletter, that goes out a couple times a month. And that's a great way to stay up to date on HMANA news and events and things coming up. So you can write your name and email address in the chat if you want to receive that. So with that, I will turn things over to Kat, who can introduce Elly.
Thanks, Julie. Hi, everybody. Today, I'm so delighted to introduce Elly Knight for our May Lunch and Learn presentation. She will be talking to us about her research on common nighthawks. Elly is an applied ecologist interested in how environmental variation across temporal and spatial scales affects the ecology and population trends of wide-ranging species. She is currently an quantitative ecologist with the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute and Boreal Avian Modeling Project at the University of Alberta. I was sure I was going to mess that up at some point. That's a mouthful. Elly has been studying common nighthawks across the continent for over a decade, including for her PhD and as a former project manager of the Canadian Nightjar Survey. So thank you so much, Elly, for joining us. Please go ahead and share your presentation now.
Thank you, Kat. Thank you, Julie. Can you hear me okay? And you can see everything looks good? Okay.
Looks great.
Great. So today I'm going to pull together a few lines of research, but primarily research that was done with a network of folks across North America studying migration of this pretty interesting species, the common nighthawk. And so this will primarily be a talk about sort of broad scale migration patterns across North America on the species and how that links to conservation. So let's jump in. So what this is going to look like today, we're going to start kind of basic. We're going to start with what's a nightjar, because I realize this is a hawk group. Probably lots of folks know what a nightjar is, but they're also kind of a quirky little group of birds. So it's kind of fun to run through what characterizes this group of birds. Then we'll meet the common nighthawk. We'll talk about their conservation status, identify some knowledge gaps and objectives of the research I'm going to share today. And then we'll get into the migration tracking itself. We'll talk about some of the results of that tracking, including descriptions of space use across the annual cycle, habitat selection across the annual cycle, migratory connectivity, and then start to get into some drivers of population trends on the breeding grounds. We're going to talk a little bit about citizen science, and then we'll wrap up with a few conclusions. So just a little bit more about me. So I was a program manager for the Wild Research Nightjar Survey from 2010 to 2020, which is sort of where I wet my feet with nightjars. That program has now become the Canadian Nightjar Survey and sort of complements the Nightjar Survey network in the United States. I did a PhD on Common Nighthawks from 2015 to 2021. I was a founding member of the Global Nightjar Network, which if this talk convinces you that nightjars are super cool, you should go join. And there'll be some details at the end about that. I know some about nightjars, but mostly I know a lot about nighthawks. And this is me with a nighthawk. So Julie kind of spoiled my first slide, but they're not the nightjar. The nighthawks are not a hawk. It's not actually a great name. They're not actually truly nocturnal either. They're more of a crepuscular species, but here we are, nighthawks. So what are they? Well, they're a member of the nightjar clade. And so this is a sort of phylogeny of all of the birds from 2015. And so you can see they're a very old, they've been called a very old and effective body design. The nightjars are way down at the bottom of the phylogenetic tree, and they haven't really changed a lot for a very long time, which makes them this kind of an interesting group of birds. And so this family, the Caprimulgidae, are distributed globally. There are 8 different clades. And here in North America, we have 2 of those clades. We have the Boreal clade and the Nighthawk clade. And so, well, what makes this group this group? And so the entire group are nocturnal or crepuscular birds. Because of that nocturnal nature, they are primarily acoustic communicators. So a lot of these species are named after the sounds that they make. Whippoorwills are a great example. They go whippoorwill. Poorwills also poor will. They all have cryptic plumage. So again, because they're nocturnal, they rely on that cryptic plumage to stay hidden during the day. So there's a nighthawk in the center of this image here. These entire clade are aerial insectivores. So this is kind of a fun little video to share. This is a bolus that I retrieved from a nighthawk during capture. So they actually carry food for their nestlings in their mouths when they forage, and then they don't regurgitate, they just spit it out. And so you can actually see the aerial insects, primarily beetles that this individual has caught, are still alive in the bolus when we retrieved it. So you can kind of imagine what that feels like in their mouth. They have all sorts of adaptations to deal with catching those aerial insects. So because they're nocturnal, they have large eyes with a reflective layer at the back of the retina. It's called the tapetum lucida. They have prominent rictal bristles, the purpose of which is just sort of still up for debate, but which probably helps them with foraging because they're catching those aerial insects. They have a tiny little bill, but when they open up, they have this huge mouth. I often sort of compare them to Jabba the Hutt, especially because like when they sit, they look like sort of the blob that is Jabba the Hutt. They have short legs with weak feet, so this group is highly aerial, especially the nighthawks. And they have a comb on the middle toe, so a lot like the herons. There are a few other species that seem to have some convergent evolution on this comb on the middle toe. It's probably for grooming, but it's kind of cool. A lot of the species have white patches for mating display. This is probably also associated with that nocturnal life strategy where, those white patches are really easy to see at night. And so basically the more white you have, the more handsome you are. And, they're not, although we consider the nightjars land birds, that they seem to have a fairly different life history strategy to a lot of passerines, at least, or songbirds. So they only lay 2 eggs per year. They lay them on bare ground. So these species use scrapes. Honestly, like a scrape is kind of a generous description in some cases. They sort of like move some stuff out of the way and then just put their eggs on the bare ground. But because of that, a lot like shorebirds, they have semi-precocial young. So their nestlings can walk straight from hatch. They're not quite as precocial as, say, a shorebird or a seabird. But the nest certainly starts to move around, especially with disruption immediately after hatch. And so here in North America, like I mentioned, we have the portable clade and we have the nighthawk clade. And there's sort of some differences between these two clades. So the portable clade, there's 7 different species. That's the porwills, the whippoorwills, the paraques. Those species are exclusively nocturnal. They're sally feeders. So they sit on a branch and they jump up and catch their prey and then go back to the branch. And so they have prominent rictal bristles, longer bills. Apparently they have softer plumage than the nighthawk clade, and then they have short round wings. The nighthawk clades, which we're going to be talking about today, there are 3 species in North America. So there's common, Antillean, and then lesser. Was it lesser or least? I can't remember which is which. Anyway, so these species are more crepuscular. This is more of a dawn and dusk active group of birds. These are continuous flight feeders. So they're a lot like a nighttime swallow. They also share a lot of sort of habitat niche with bats. They have smaller rictal bristles, shorter bills, less soft plumage. I can't remember where I read that, but I always thought it was interesting. And then they have really long pointed wings, and that's probably an adaptation for the fact that they are these continuous flight feeders. So a lot more like a big swallow. And so here's our common nighthawk that we're going to look at today. And so, you know, again, we're here within the phylogeny of the nightjars themselves. There are 6 species within the Cordalis genus, 3 of which are migratory. I think it's the sort of jury's out on whether the other 3 just stay in South America and are non-migratory, or whether they migrate within South America. Because these species are highly cryptic, there's very little known about a lot of them. And so, you know, like I said, they're sort of like big swallows that come out at dusk, which is sort of the origin of the word Cordalis. Cordalis means evening dancers, which is sort of a really lovely, description of, I'm sure you've all seen nighthawks foraging at dusk. I think it's a really lovely description of their activity. Okay, so let's get into common nighthawks themselves. So this species has an incredibly large breeding range, probably one of the largest breeding ranges in the Western Hemisphere. And that means that they breed in a wide variety of habitats, from sand spits, rocky barrens, grasslands, sandy pine forests, the Boreal shield, saw palmetto scrub in Florida, all sorts of different habitats across the breeding grounds in North America. From what we can tell, they have a pretty diverse and opportunistic diet. So, you know, yes, they're eating aerial insects, but, you know, it kind of just depends on what's on the menu that day. You know, we found they eat a lot of beetles up here in the Boreal forest, where you see beetles coming into post-fire areas, but, you know, in other areas, they eat lots of flying ants or mosquitoes or whatever. They're pretty mobile, so they kind of go for whatever's around. Again, they lay 2 eggs. Typically, they have 1 brood. You know, they incubate for 20 or so days, and then the nestlings, it's another 20 to 25 days before they're ready to fly. And so, you know, at least, especially up here in Canada, where the breeding season is relatively short, that typically limits them to 1 brood. And then they have 2 sounds, which you're probably familiar with. They have the vocal peent, and then they also have this super cool mechanical wing plume display. And so I'm going to show a video. Hopefully I shared the sound right. Julie or Kat, if it's not working, maybe just holler and I'll try and figure that out. But this is a video that one of the field technicians I worked with during my PhD, Timothy Forrester, took. It's a real quick display. The wing boom, so they basically do a steep aerial dive, and at the bottom of that dive, they bend their wingtips down, and as the wind rushes through those wingtips, it creates this wing flutter that creates this booming sound. But the video is going to play once, and then it'll slow down so you can see the wingtips. But it also slows down the frequency of the sound, so it might sound a little bit like Halloween sound effects. Anyway, let's give it a shot. Did you hear the sound? Did it work? Yeah, okay. So you can kind of see the bottom of that when it's slowed down, you can see the curvature of the wingtips at the bottom of the dive. It's pretty neat. And that call and wing boom are there's lots of colloquial names for nighthawks. There's like bull bats is a really common one in the south, but one of my favorite is Frank and Beans, which I think refers to the 2 sounds that they make. Frank is the peent and Beans is the boom, I guess. Anyway, so Anyway, despite all these cool facts about nighthawks, they are declining across the range. So here in Canada, we've seen about a negative 2.5% decline per year over the last 30 years. And so, from an IUCN perspective, the species is least concern because that breeding range is so large and the population size is quite large. But because of the declines themselves here in Canada, they are listed as special concern under our Federal Species at Risk Act, and they have been listed as imperiled in several of the eastern United States as well. I think that one of the important things to point out on this map, this is breeding bird survey data here, which will sort of be relevant to some of the talk later on, is that there are, like many species, we do see some variation in that population trend across the range, though it's not all red, which means that there are some populations that are still doing okay. And so part of what we'll talk about today is how to understand why that is in some areas and not in others. So at a species level, I mean, I think when we talk about, well, why is this species declining? We look at some sort of cohesion across guilds. And so at least here in Canada, and this is true in the United States with similar surveys, when we look at the guild level, we see that this whole group of aerial insectivore birds is declining quite rapidly, as are the grassland birds. And so there's a lot of proposed mechanisms for why this might be occurring. Anything from phenological mismatch, which is essentially like as climate change continues to advance seasons, species that are migrating long distances are no longer arriving in time to hit sort of peak resource availability. So they're missing, peaks in aerial insect availability essentially because they're coming late to the party. Things like wetland loss and aerial insects are produced at wetlands, certainly outside of the boreal forest, and so that it's a really important food source. Pesticide application, light pollution, these are nocturnal species, increased weather extremes, lots of potential reasons, habitat loss, vehicle collisions, climate change, pollution, predation. There's this very, very, very long list. And so it's difficult to understand when there's so many different potential mechanisms and you have a migratory species that occupies many spaces at different times across the annual cycle. So we're going to talk a little bit about trying to disentangle some of these things. Now, common nighthawks have been called the most studied nightjar in North America, but there's still a lot of gaps. So this is a range map that I actually pulled out of a book I have called Nightjars of the World. You can kind of see it's kind of a crappy photo and you can see like the shine of the page. But I think I wanted to show this one because this is a distribution of the species across the full annual cycle. And you can see that in South America on the wintering grounds, and even during migration, it's mostly a lot of question marks. And so until we did the research that I'm going to share with you today, we didn't really know where this species was going outside of the breeding season. I think there have been some species accounts written up, but because they're very easily confused with a lot of other species like Antillean and lesser nighthawks, and because they're quiet and cryptic on the wintering grounds, we don't really know that much about them. And especially because you'll see where most of them are spending their wintering grounds, there's not a lot of eBird coverage in the areas where a lot of the species is going. And so some of the knowledge gaps that we're going to try and cover today are migratory connectivity. Where are they going? What monitoring methods are best for this species, given that it is crepuscular, and also some of the attributes across the full annual cycle. What are the areas that this species, or what are the sort of habitat attributes that the species is keying in on that we should think about from a conservation perspective? And again, why do we not know much? They're cryptic, they're nocturnal, they're super mobile, and that makes them especially hard to study. So the research objectives I'm going to run you through today, the first thing we're going to do is describe space use across the annual cycle, just to kind of get an idea of like how much space are they using, what's a home range size, because that's going to allow us to sort of look at things like habitat associations and stuff. So we'll use that space use information to understand habitat selection across the annual cycle. We're then going to go and describe migratory connectivity, which I'll explain as a concept when we get there. And then we'll bring all those things together to correlate habitat attributes with population monitoring on the breeding grounds to start to try and disentangle some of those causes of trend. But first, tracking challenges. So nighthawks weigh anywhere from 50 to 85 grams. I once caught a female that was over 100 grams. She was like absolute beast. But it means that you can't just put tracking collars on them, and they certainly can't take a lot of the tags that most of the raptors, I'm sure y'all are familiar with, can handle. They are not a bison. You know, typically with birds, we try and stick to tags that are 3 to 5% of the body weight, especially for a species as mobile as a common nighthawk. So that puts us in the realm of like 2 to 3 grams for a tag. And that really limits what we can do with the data. The other issue is accuracy. So when we want to look at things like habitat attributes, you know, using data that comes from the Argos satellite or geolocators is not necessarily adequate. And so we probably want GPS tags, but that again requires more battery life to obtain. And then the third is retrieval. So you'll see a little bit why as we get further into the talk, and we talk a little bit about space use, but recatching nighthawks catching nighthawks period is really hard. Recatching nighthawks is incredibly challenging. So just to give you a little bit of context, we put out about 90 tags on this species. And everyone across a bunch of different populations, and everyone tried to recapture their tags, and we got 3. 2 of them I got. And that was only because we had data that told us where the species was. Because they're so mobile, you know, sometimes you'll think you're catching a territorial individual, but it'll actually turn out to be like Joe from 5 kilometers down the road, and you're never going to see Joe again. So you're going to be trying to recatch where you caught him the year prior, and he's never coming back. Yeah, they're not an easy species. So what did we use? We use these Argos GPS tags. So this is a low-tech product. They're 3.5 grams. So we were definitely at the upper limit of what these birds could carry. There were some populations like the Florida population, which are quite small, that we weren't able to put them on because they were too heavy. But what's nice about these tags is that they collect those GPS points that we need to describe habitat selection. And then what they do is they take a handful of points, and then they actually, there were a couple different versions of firmware that we use, but the version of firmware that most of the tags used, they know where the Argos satellite is going to be, and then as it passes by, they basically just like scream at the sky for 15 minutes and try and upload those GPS points to the Argos satellite itself, so that we then as researchers can download them from the Argos satellite, and we don't need to retrieve the tags to get the data. The trade-off is that screaming at the sky is incredibly energy intensive. And so we only get, you know, anywhere from 30 to 60 points from a tag if they work at all. A lot of the tags that we deployed didn't seem to sort of exceed the power threshold that was required for that transmission. In contrast, for tags that you do retrieve, you get sort of an order of magnitude more points. So typically somewhere around 600 points. But, you know, it means that we got data, and that's huge. So we put these Argos GPS tags on adult males and females. We put out about 90 tags at 13 locations across the breeding range. And what we were trying really hard to do is to put those tags across a gradient of population trend, so that we could start to sort of understand, okay, well, what are the conditions in areas where they're increasing relative to the conditions in areas where they're really decreasing, and try to use that to understand what some of those drivers of population trend are. So I got to work with a really cool group of people across this network, this sort of standardized collaborative network. It was a real privilege to work with all these folks. So clicking right. Okay, right. So you're probably wondering, okay, I mentioned catching a nighthawk is hard. Probably wondering, well, how do you catch a nighthawk? You use Maurice. So this is Maurice, the bird. The person is Janet, who developed this capture technique for common nighthawks during her master's thesis at the University of Regina. Maurice is essentially like the most handsome nighthawk of all time because he has these big white status signaling patches that we talked about being really important for mate attraction in nightjars. So Maurice is very threatening to a territorial nighthawk. I realize he may not look threatening to you. The googly eyes are there mostly for my own entertainment, but it's those white status signaling patches that are really key. And so this is what happens. This is how you catch a nighthawk. I'm going to show a short video. So the key to catching a nighthawk, because they're so mobile and they have really good vision, is that you have to put Maurice in the net. Because they get so angry that they try and attack him, and then they go in the net. Otherwise, they can see the net's there and they're never going in it. So you can see there's a wing boom there. And we're using playbacks to call the territorial individual, hopefully territorial individual, in. And then he eventually tries to get at Maurice and makes a mistake and ends up in the net. But without Maurice in the net, then that was a really key contribution of Janet's thesis there, and her capture technique. Without Maurice in the net, you probably won't catch the nighthawks. There was another master's student after Janet who didn't know that you had to put Maurice in the net, and he did not catch any nighthawks for one season, and it was sad for him. Because they have such good vision, like they know that the net is there. And so they try and get at Maurice. I have had territorial individuals actually knock Maurice out of the net trying to get at him. They can be really quite aggressive. So this is what the data look like from those 85 tags that we put out. Because of that Argos transmission, you can see that the data is not perfect. So the dots are basically data points across a date on the x-axis, and then we've got the different populations or different deployment locations on the y-axis. And you can see it's real patchy. Some of the tags worked really well, some of them didn't. That inconsistent sampling did make the data kind of hard to work with. But again, we had data, which was a big deal. And so we used some interpolation approaches to kind of transform this inconsistent data into migration trajectories. And so we had a video put together for this data set. This was obviously a pretty massive project that was primarily led by the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center with support from Environment and Climate Change Canada. And so we put together a video that shows what this data set looks like. we don't need to watch all the credits, but you get the idea. So it's pretty neat. I mean, there's some pretty cool broad scale patterns within that data set. So I'm going to pull out a few cool migration facts from that video. And also I did at one point attempt deploying some of the purely archival GPS tags on individuals. So we do have one data set that has 600 points in it. I was able to get one back. And so we learned some kind of cool things from that single data set as well, that we could kind of then go back and look at the larger, less temporally high resolution data set and see, oh, okay, yeah, like there are individuals that are also doing some of these things. We couldn't see it at first. So it was helpful in kind of interpreting that larger data set. So some cool migration facts. Okay. First of all, nighthawks don't use the Pacific flyway. So this was something that was kind of cool. And we're actually starting to see in some of the other aerial insectivores as well. There's a big bank swallow project that is seeing some similar migration patterns to our data set. So all individuals seem to gather at the Pacific flyway. That means that individuals that are breeding on the west coast of North America are flying due east across the Rockies before turning south. We had one individual from sort of around Vancouver Island in British Columbia, flight like literally 3,000 kilometers due east before turning south. And so that's a pretty unusual migration pattern. It's probably a relic from post-glacial population expansion. So sort of the way that the species range expanded. And so they're basically just using this ancestral migration route. And they haven't learned about the Pacific flyway, basically. Nearly all individuals cross the Gulf. And so the one thing that we learned that was super cool from that higher resolution data set, that one data set with 600 data points, is that during pre-breeding migration or spring migration, these individuals can fly for 3.5 days nonstop for 5,000 kilometers. So, they're basically going from Northern Colombia. They don't even stop at the Gulf Coast. They just keep going. They basically, they can fly past Texas in a single flight. This is a super mobile species. So that was pretty cool. And when we went back and looked at the larger data set, that was one of the things where it's like, oh yeah, there are definitely other individuals that are also doing this massive leap across the Gulf during spring migration that we just couldn't tell before without that higher resolution data set. Flight speed is about 40 kilometers an hour, but they can hit over 100 kilometers an hour with tailwinds coming off the Gulf. So that's also pretty cool. They're pretty fast. And a round trip. So for some of the individuals that we tracked, up in the Yukon and the Northwest Territories, they're hitting somewhere over 20,000 kilometers for a round trip. So this is a pretty substantial migration. And again, that morphology, those long wingtips, probably helps them with their foraging, but it probably also facilitates their migration capacity. The other thing to see is that most birds don't do stopovers. So I think a lot of the assumptions that we make about migration, at least from the songbird literature, don't necessarily hold for nighthawks. This is more of a fly and forage migrant. Again, we talked about them being kind of opportunistic in terms of their diet. Seems like they're doing that on migration as well. They don't really tend to stay anywhere for long durations of time. They'll kind of hang out and forage around and then move a little bit at one day. And there certainly are regions within their migration where they'll slow down, but they're not really doing true stopovers where they're coming back to the same tree or whatever roost site day after day. The caveat with that is that there was a paper published just last year by Christina Cockle and some colleagues who have been catching individuals on the stationary non-breeding grounds in Argentina. And so they tracked, I think, 5 or 6 individuals who ended up all breeding. They were all part of the Florida breeding population. And those individuals did show sort of a prolonged stopover during post-breeding migration, during fall migration, in the Cerrado biome. So the circle on this map here is their sort of like wintering grounds, or where they were caught. And those larger triangles, sort of in central Brazil there, those are locations, and also I guess the ones up in Colombia too, where they seemed to kind of hang out for a couple of weeks. And they think, Cockle et al. Think that this might be a molt stopover. Again, that high resolution tracking data set that we obtained with the 600 points showed no indication of this. So it may be a population specific trait. Again, all of the birds that they tracked ended up breeding on the Florida Panhandle. So it may be that some populations are doing this and not others. That particular population is really small. The birds are only 50 grams, so mating migration takes longer or is more effort for those individuals. It's hard to say. But I think, needless to say, I think this is a really good example of where we've learned a lot in the last few years about nighthawk migration, but there's actually a lot more here to understand. And because this is such a wide-ranging species, there's probably lots of variation across the species in their migration traits. So let's get a little bit into some of the research. I realize it's 10:35, so we'll kind of speed through some of the results and sort of in terms of the analysis that we did. But basically what we learned from the big tracking data set is that the area that these individuals use really varies strongly across the breeding seasons, or across the seasons. So in the breeding grounds, these individuals are using a home range of about 70 square kilometers. I've mentioned they're mobile. They're really mobile. Like 70 square kilometers is a lot of area for a single individual bird, at least one that we sort of consider a land bird. On the non-breeding stationary grounds, though, so the wintering grounds, they're using a really small home range, really only 2 kilometers. And then these migration, I've called them sort of stopovers on this slide here. These are those areas where they do seem to at least slow down and forage over a couple of days to forage more. These are large areas, so we're talking 10,000 square kilometers for a stopover. And sorry, the figure here on the left-hand panel is basically the histogram or the distribution of those areas across individuals that we were able to estimate these areas for. The middle column is basically like an example over satellite imagery of what that area looks like with the kernel density estimation surface over it. So basically the more purple the color is, the higher the probability that that individual is spending time there. And then the yellow colors are sort of like the edge of that distribution. And then the right-hand column is essentially that's the study design we used for the next slide for habitat selection. So the black spot is basically the point that we know that individual used, and then we're comparing the attributes at that black spot where we know that individual is to randomly distributed white spots within a size area of approximately the area that the home range area for that season. So it's basically, this is a sort of classic habitat selection study design where you're comparing used to the other potential areas that individual could have chosen. And so what we found from that is that, maybe this is surprising, maybe this isn't, but that habitat selection really varies with seasons. So basically on the breeding grounds, these individuals are selecting for open areas. So they're selecting away from areas that have high tree cover or high enhanced vegetation index, which is essentially, EVI is essentially a measure of greenness. And that's probably as a nesting resource. So there was some other work I published in my PhD that suggested that nighthawks are selecting for open areas primarily as for the resources that they provide for nesting. Like I mentioned, they lay their eggs on bare ground, and so they need an open area with well-drained soil to put those eggs on. And so, you can kind of see that in the plot here. So basically along the x-axis are the different habitat attributes that we looked at. So canopy cover, forest patch size, enhanced vegetation index, percent of water, and percent of cropland. And then on the y-axis are the different seasons. And then we've looked at it at 2 scales, basically like a really local habitat selection, a really local roost site scale, and then more at the whole range scale. And the distributions that are darker or more opaque are the ones that are sort of significant. They basically don't overlap that dotted line, which is 0. So you can see that dark yellow on the breeding grounds with respect to percent canopy cover. That's avoidance of canopy cover in the breeding grounds. But then, in contrast, basically during the non-breeding stationary season, they are selecting for forested areas. So they're interested in canopy cover and, areas of higher greenness. And so perhaps that's for the foraging resources. They don't need to lay eggs on the bare ground during the non-breeding season. And so really, they're probably interested in areas where they can sort of roost and be cryptic, and also areas with high aerial insect productivity. And then there's minimal selection during migration, and this sort of fits with some of the other habitat selection work coming out of the sort of migration research right now, is that, what individuals select for during migration changes throughout migration, and that, you know, there isn't necessarily strong selection during that season. They're more interested in just getting to where they need to go. And the other thing that was interesting, it was, you know, similar selection between the two scales. So they're still selecting for the same things regardless of whether they're thinking about it at a very local site or at a larger site. Okay, so now I'm going to explain the migratory connectivity piece, but first we'll do a little bit of sort of theoretical background. So migratory connectivity is essentially, it's the extent to which populations are connected across the annual cycle. And so it's typically estimated relative to the breeding grounds, which, you know, from a North American perspective, that's kind of, we're going to be looking at monitoring data on the breeding grounds. So that's the comparison that we're interested in. And so when we measure migratory connectivity between -1 and 1. And so it's basically a measure of how much populations are staying together. So on the top in this rose-breasted grosbeak here, you can see migratory connectivity is close to 1. It's really strong because breeding populations, you know, individuals from breeding populations are staying together on the non-breeding grounds. They're not mixing together with the other, you know, the yellow and the green populations. It's basically like they're just sticking in groups. Whereas with the green-winged teal example on the bottom, you know, we're seeing weak migratory connectivity, you know, an MC measure closer to 0, where you have these breeding populations that are all mixing together on the wintering grounds. And it essentially means, the reason that this is really important from a conservation perspective is that connectivity is essentially a proxy for population vulnerability to local environmental conditions. When connectivity is high, it means that individuals from the same population are subject to the same local environmental conditions. And so if they're subject to the same local environmental conditions, that population is then vulnerable to stochastic or anthropogenic impacts that could contribute to population declines. And there's a great figure in Will Cresswell's ecology paper that demonstrates this idea where, you know, if connectivity is low, like in this example here on the right, where everyone's mixing together in that blue wintering ground area, then we should see, you know, the same survival rates across the wintering range. And when you add that to the survival rate from the breeding grounds, you get these differential population trends like we've talked about, but they're primarily driven by what the individuals are experiencing on the breeding grounds. And that's why evaluating migratory connectivity has been quoted as a useful first step in evaluating the causes of differential population trends among locations. Okay, so what does migratory connectivity look like for this species? Well, overall, it's low. And, you know, that's probably not surprising given that we talked about they kind of all come together on this common migration route along the Mississippi Flyway and then mix together on the wintering grounds. But that's not, I mean, okay, so yes, that's kind of useful to know, but it's not surprising. A lot of long distance species have low migratory connectivity. So what we did is we basically estimated, we wanted to look for areas where there were peaks in migratory connectivity to kind of key in on, okay, well, what times and places during the annual cycle might these populations still be a little bit more separated that we can potentially look at drivers of trend within. So we estimated migratory connectivity at equal intervals across migration, both spatially and temporally. And we did find that there was elevated migratory connectivity at certain times and places of the year. So the first was obviously on the breeding grounds when all the populations are still separate, and they do stay quite separate until they hit that Mississippi Flyway. During post-migration here, sort of in northern South America, in late October, there still seems to be some temporal segregation of populations. Somewhat on the non-breeding grounds, it was a little bit elevated relative to sort of baseline, and then we saw quite a sharp peak in spatial connectivity right before pre-breeding migration. So in northern Colombia, there does seem to maybe be some staging that's happening there. This is one of those areas where individuals are slowing down and sort of doing their stopovers, and it seems like maybe there is a little bit more organization by population in this region. So what we did is we used those 4 areas as locations for which to look at, okay, well, what are the environmental conditions that individuals are using in those areas? And so we extracted a few different environmental covariates. We looked at forest regrowth, cumulative crop conversion, and annual drought index. These are potential mechanisms that really have been given quite a bit of weight within the conservation planning literature for this species as potential drivers of population trend. And we kind of matched those to monitoring data from the breeding grounds temporally and then we basically looked at explaining variation in that monitoring data by these covariates that individuals are experiencing across the annual cycle. So I'm not going to get into the details of this analysis, but basically, you know, I think, yeah, sorry, let me just think about this figure for a minute. You can see, so the three different covariates that we looked at drought index, forest regrowth, and then crop conversion. And these are our populations on the breeding grounds that we were able to look at we were able to parse out the drivers of monitoring trend data for it. And so we'll go through the 4 seasons of the annual cycle and look at you know, where were the significant effects. So we can see you know, when individuals are still on the breeding grounds, we can see that there is negative effects of both forest regrowth and crop conversion on some of these populations, and the sort of intensity of the color is the strength of the effect on abundance. So during post-spring migration or fall migration, not seeing a whole lot. You actually see some positive effects of forest regrowth on some populations in Northern South America, which sort of fits with what we learned from the habitat selection analyses. Again, pretty tepid effects during the stationary non-breeding season or the wintering season. And then, you know, we saw some stronger effects of crop conversion in that northern Colombian area where we think individuals are slowing down and potentially gathering resources before they make that big flight across the Gulf during spring migration. So I think, you know, I think we're still working on publishing this piece, so that's kind of why I'm stumbling through it a little bit. But I think that the really notable effects here are that a lot of the negative effects of these covariates that we looked at were on the breeding grounds. And then crop conversion had consistently negative effects across the annual cycle, especially during that spring migration period. So the last thing I want to point out is that we weren't able to do that last analysis that I showed, parsing out the drivers of monitoring data trends without targeted surveys. So we actually did that analysis 2 ways. And what I've showed there is an integrated analysis between breeding bird survey data and what used to be called the Wild Research Nightjar Survey, was now the Canadian Nightjar Survey and the Nightjar Survey Network in the US. So these targeted crepuscular and nocturnal surveys we've shown are really, really important for monitoring and conservation of this species. So we published a paper where we compared these nocturnal or these targeted surveys to the breeding bird survey. And we used primarily Western Canada for this analysis because that's what we had data from at the time. But, you know, essentially, for common nighthawks, the probability of observing the species drops to 0 right before the dawn survey start of the breeding bird survey. In contrast, the Canadian Nightjar Survey protocol is really centered right over the period of peak activity for this species. And that's true for day of year as well. At least for common nighthawks, the breeding bird survey is a little bit often too early. Common nighthawks are one of the last species to arrive on the breeding grounds, especially up here in Canada. And so we found, you know, the ability to detect a 30% decline in populations is about 35% with the breeding bird survey versus 70% with these targeted dusk surveys. So these are really key citizen science surveys or community science surveys for monitoring the species and for understanding drivers of trend of the species. And I also want to give a shout out to migration monitoring, which Julie mentioned at the beginning as well. So this is a paper that just came out in Avian Conservation and Ecology this year, but it's essentially looking at the value of migration monitoring to estimate population trend. And it does show some potential. So this is essentially a power analysis probability of detecting a trend you know, over a period of time. And so, you know, it looks like for, you know, a pretty substantial decline. I mean, we're looking at a 50% decline, but you know, you probably only need about 15 years of monitoring data to detect that trend. And this was just with one station of migration monitoring data. This was sort of a small data set that these folks had gathered. So I think there's potential to use migration monitoring to estimate trend and potentially, especially as we learn more about the migratory connectivity of the species, to connect those data with the populations that they're coming from in a sort of integrated analysis. So I think hopefully there will continue to be more work in this space in the coming years. So I think the conclusions here are pretty basic, but I think one of the big things that we learned from this, and for some of the breeding ground research I did during my PhD, is that common nighthawks are super mobile, and we have to think about that mobility when we're thinking about how to conserve this species. I think I went into this PhD with a songbird, a sort of pastoral ecology background, and I very quickly learned to throw all of those assumptions out because they just don't hold for this taxa. And I think for a lot of the nightjars as well, comparing some of this work to work on whippoorwills and some of the European nightjars, it does seem like there are traits across the nightjar family that are quite consistent and that are very different from songbirds. From a conservation perspective, I think it's becoming increasingly obvious that we should focus our conservation efforts on populations with high levels of crop conversion, especially during those stationary seasons, and potentially also in that area of northern Colombia. And I think the other important thing that was sort of emerging from a lot of the migration research right now is that habitat selection varies across the annual cycle, and this really affects how potential threats affect populations. The results from our habitat selection analysis were really concordant with the results from our population trend analysis. That they prefer open areas during the breeding grounds and closed areas during the non-breeding grounds. And so we can't necessarily make assumptions what was happening on the non-breeding grounds based on the ecology of species on the breeding grounds. So if you want to know more about nighthawks, I suggest you also go check out Alora Graham's research. So she's just finishing up her PhD right now, but she works with MODIS tracking data. And so she knows a lot more about the specific timing of migration and differences between juveniles and adults and males and females. She doesn't necessarily have the big picture because a lot of these individuals are going to areas of the deep Amazon in Brazil, where there obviously are no MODIS stations. But she knows a lot more about the sort of inter-individual differences in timing. And so she's got lots of really cool stuff. And then if you're interested in nightjars, you should join the Global Nightjar Network. It's a sort of loose group of nightjar enthusiasts, so researchers, but also community scientists and artists, just general nightjar enthusiasts. They hold an annual virtual free conference that is really sort of quite multidisciplinary. So you should check it out. And with that, I just want to thank, this is a pretty big body of research. So all the organizations provided funding for my salary and for the research itself, and the massive group of folks that have contributed to especially the data set in particular. So thanks to all of them. And then I'm going to leave you with this picture. There is a nighthawk somewhere in this photo. So I'm going to leave this up while we answer some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Elly. That was incredibly informative. We have a few questions. One question from Gretchen is, are adults sexually dimorphic and how do you sex them?
So they are. This is one area where they do overlap. The trait does overlap a little bit with songbirds. So the males have much brighter white patches, whereas in the females, it tends to be a little bit buffier. So that throat patch, the wing patches, and then also the patch on the tail. But like songbirds, some of the older females will display white in the throat and white in the wing patch. So you have to be a little bit careful sometimes when you're doing that sexing. And certainly in northern populations, the females are often larger than the males as well.
Great. And Lynn wants to know what percentage of the North American population migrates to South America. She says it seems like the Texas birds stayed through December.
So I think the text, we did track from Texas. I would say it's probably close to 99.9%. I think there may be some individuals that are kind of pushing the boundaries of migration. So I think the other thing that that's kind of emerging, especially about this species, is with that mobility, there's a lot of opportunism. And so this is quite an aggressive species from a dispersal perspective, and we don't know that much about dispersal. Is really hard to study, but we did tag one individual at my PhD field site, and he ended up breeding 300 kilometers away the next year. So the dispersal capacity of the species is really, really high, and I suspect what's happening in Texas, it seems like we're starting to see it more and more in the eBird data, is that there are individuals that might be overwintering, it's a change in the distribution of the species with a changing climate, and that those are particularly aggressive dispersers that are just trying it out. They're sticking around, especially with a species that has such a massive population size. You know, there's probably extremes of the distribution of personality traits that drive that aggressive dispersal. So that's my guess, but I don't know. All the individuals that we tagged from Texas migrated. So it's hard to say. They do, you know, like you get a nighthawk showing up in Europe usually once a year as well. So again, it's just that like extreme mobility and like quite opportunistic life history strategy that's probably driving some of that.
Awesome.
I would love to talk more about it though. It's fascinating to me.
I have one quick question. I wonder, is there a standardized citizen science effort to monitor the migration, and how can people sign up, or is eBird data utilized by your efforts?
There is no standardized protocol for migration monitoring for this species right now. So we have standardized breeding survey protocols, but I think that that's an area that could use some work. I unfortunately don't have the capacity to take it on, but I think if there are folks within this group that are interested, I'm certainly happy to sort of participate and provide advice if, you know, there's an informal working group that wants to get together. There's also a fellow, Logan, I'm forgetting Logan's last name. Would follow up with me and we can chat more about it, but Logan is sort of taking on the Nightjar Survey network. The US survey system is sort of transitioning over to his program management. And so he's sort of one of the leads on the Global Nightjar Network steering committee right now as well. And so it would probably be good to kind of tap in with him and see if he's thought about it at all. But I think given the lessons we've learned about standardizing the breeding survey monitoring protocol, I don't think it would be hard to put together. And I think there would be a lot of value in working on that.
Great.
Great
and
idea.
I know you have to leave at exactly 1. So I'm gonna just thank you so much again. There's another question,
Sure.
but we'll have to maybe do it over email.
We can, I don't mind. It's not a super important next meeting, so we can do a last question.
Okay, so Robert says, my colleagues at the National Aviary in Pittsburgh, Dr. Steve Latta, has found that the nest predation by crows may be a very important negative driver on productivity in urban areas where nighthawks have dramatically declined. Did you look at habitat and geography-based variation in productivity, either through fieldwork or literature review?
So there is not a lot of productivity data for this species. I have some, Laura Graham has some from her PhD thesis. There's a little bit, I think, from Texas. Apparent survival is very high at my study site where I did my PhD, upwards of 70%. But it's like 2.5 hours north of Fort McMurray. It's quite rural. I think there, I think there's a chance that predation is driving some of those declines as well. I mean, I think Alora's apparent survival is much lower, and she's seeing a lot of predation from mammals like raccoons. And I think there's a chance that it's driving some of those urban declines. The leading train of thought on the declines in urban areas is change in roof construction, where nighthawks used to lay their eggs on gravel rooftops, but now that those gravel rooftops are being replaced with tar, or sort of like membrane rooftops, that's no longer suitable habitat. So I think that's part of it. I think the crows are probably part of it. I will say I have read the Latta paper, and I retain a healthy amount of skepticism about artificial egg experiments, where it's not necessarily a very good replication of a natural system or situation where you have an individual that is defending the nest, that is, providing the cryptic camouflage of the nest. I think that there's a lot of traits that nighthawks have that might potentially change the predation rate relative to just putting eggs on a rooftop. So I suspect that there's definitely some contribution of corvids to those declines, but my guess is that the proportion is probably lower than that paper reported because it's not a natural exploration of productivity rates. So that's my one caveat there. I think that was a very long answer. Sorry.
No worries. Thank you so much. I'm gonna hand it over to Julie, and she's gonna do some outgoing messages.
Okay.
Thank you so much,
Thanks.
Elly, again. This is wonderful.
Yeah, thank you, Kat, and thank you so much, Elly. That was wonderful. I definitely learned a lot I didn't know about nighthawks. And I'm already looking forward to their migration season. We'll have to connect at some point about potentially using migration monitoring from Hawkwatch sites. We partner with the Xerces and we send migration data on monarch butterflies and dragonflies. So there's, potential to add a data field to hawk count. We have hundreds of people counting migrants every day of the season. I think it makes a lot of sense to partner on that and maybe start making it more of a standardized count. So we'll have to be in touch about that.
Yeah, please do get in touch. I'd love to chat more about it. I think especially from a quantitative perspective, I'm really interested in trying to integrate the data types. So yeah, please do reach out. We should chat more.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again. So stay tuned for our June Lunch and Learn coming up. Next month, we're going to be hearing from Bryce Robinson, researcher and artist. He's going to be speaking about the Red-tailed Hawk Project, and his research focuses on the evolution of diversity of the species. So that's actually happening a little earlier than usual in our monthly series, June 5th. So you can register for that on our website or our Facebook page under the events. Or you can wait and receive our e-newsletter. We'll be sending out a registration link there in the next week or two. And I'll just quickly mention that it's Raptorathon season at HMANA, and we have so many great teams that are raising money for HMANA programs and their local sites. So you can support Raptorathon teams by visiting our website. You can also become a HMANA member there, which is a great way to support raptors. And we have our conference coming up in the fall, so we're hoping to open registration this month, by the end of this month. So stay tuned for more info on that. And just thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today, for supporting HMANA's work and what we do for the Migration Monitoring Network. Thanks again, Elly, and I hope to see everybody next month. Have a great day.